It was a crisp winter evening in New York City, where the skyline glittered like a constellation, its towering glass structures reflecting the chaos and beauty of the city that never slept. The lights from the skyscrapers cast long shadows on the street below, a stark contrast to the warmth of the luxury lounges and upscale bars that lined the streets of Manhattan. In one of those plush bars, a woman stood alone, her silhouette framed by the window, staring out into the bright, bustling city that seemed so alive yet so far removed from her own thoughts. Sarah, a successful but exhausted doctor, had always believed that she was in control of her life. Every move she made was calculated, planned meticulously in advance. Her rise through the ranks in the medical field was no accident. She had worked relentlessly, pushing herself to the edge, sacrificing relationships, and putting her personal life on hold. Everything had a place and a purpose, and for the most part she had made peace with the sacrifices. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't thinking about work or the endless list of patients waiting for her care. Tonight she was letting go. She had told herself she deserved a night out, something to celebrate her recent promotion as head of pediatrics at one of the city's most prestigious children's hospitals. It wasn't her usual scene. She didn't fit in with the glittering socialites and polished businessmen that filled the room, but for once she wasn't going to care. A champagne flute was placed in her hand, and she took a sip, feeling the bubbles dance on her tongue, letting the moment envelop her. Her best friend Jasmine had insisted on joining her for the night, urging her to step out of her comfort zone. Jasmine, ever the extrovert and corporate lawyer, had always been the one to push Sarah out of her rigid world. She had always been the responsible one, the one who never let her guard down. But tonight, as the intoxicating rhythm of the city's nightlife pulsed around her, Sarah could feel herself starting to relax. For the first time in a long while, she was starting to live in the moment. But then, from across the room, their eyes met. At first it was subtle, just a fleeting moment, but the intensity of it was undeniable. He stood there, tall and commanding, his dark eyes fixed on her. He wasn't like the others in the bar, the ones who flirted easily and who only saw her as a successful woman in a cocktail dress. No, his gaze seemed to pierce through her, as though he could see past her carefully constructed walls and into the very core of who she was. And in that instant, something inside her shifted. It was like the world had stilled, and all she could hear was the rapid beating of her heart. Jasmine noticed the change in Sarah immediately, her playful voice cutting through the air. "Don't look now, but that's Dominic Thorne," she whispered. Sarah frowned in confusion. The name meant nothing to her. She wasn't into the world of powerful businessmen and socialites. Her life revolved around the patients she cared for, the children who depended on her, not the corporate powerhouses that ran the city. But something about him, the way he stood in the room as if he owned it, intrigued her. Dominic Thorne was a name that could command attention without ever being spoken. A tycoon, a billionaire whose influence spread across industries, healthcare, real estate, and finance. Yet to Sarah, he was just another stranger, a man who seemed completely out of place in her carefully constructed life. But as she turned slightly to face him, their eyes locked again. She could feel the pull between them, magnetic and undeniable. It was a connection that transcended words or introductions. For a brief moment, everything else around her faded. She excused herself, needing a moment to breathe. The bathroom was quiet, almost too quiet. As she gazed at her reflection in the mirror, she had always been the one who played by the rules, who stuck to the plan, and yet here she was, feeling something she hadn't felt in years: desire. It was a dangerous feeling, one that could lead her to make decisions she wasn't prepared for. And yet a voice in the back of her mind urged her to let go, to stop overthinking for once. "You're allowed to want things for yourself," she whispered to her reflection, surprising herself. For a moment, she imagined a life beyond the hospital, beyond the responsibility she carried. Could she allow herself to just live? When she returned to the bar, he was still there, positioned near the path she would take. He wasn't overt, but his presence was unmistakable. As she passed him, the spicy notes of his cologne teased her senses, and the briefest touch of his gaze sent shivers down her spine. He stepped forward, his voice deep and smooth. "Do you always use geography as a pickup line?" he asked, and she couldn't help but laugh, the tension of the moment melting away. His name was Dominic Thorne, and as the night unfolded, Sarah found herself drawn to him in ways she didn't understand. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, as though they had known each other for years, sharing stories, dreams, and passions. There was a depth to him that intrigued her, a quiet strength that made her feel seen, understood. For the first time in a long time, she found herself wanting more than just a fleeting connection. But even as they spoke, something tugged at the back of her mind. The world she had built was so different from his. She was a doctor dedicated to healing, to saving lives. He was a tycoon, a man whose world revolved around power, business, and influence. What did she have to offer a man like him? And yet, as the night wore on and the city shimmered beneath them, she realized that for once she wasn't thinking about the future or the consequences. She was simply present. As the night ended, Dominic leaned in close, his voice low. "Come home with me," he whispered. There was no pressure in his words, just an invitation. And for the first time in her life, Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't consider the rules or the consequences. She followed her heart. That was the night that changed everything for Sarah. A single night with a man she barely knew would alter the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't planned to fall into his world, to let him into her life so completely. But here she was, on the edge of a decision that could either destroy everything she had worked for or open her up to a future she couldn't yet comprehend. Weeks later, Sarah would learn she was pregnant, but not with just one child. Not with two. She was carrying quadruplets. The revelation was as shocking as it was life-altering. How could this have happened? She barely knew him. She had let her guard down for one night, and now she was carrying 4 children, 4 little lives depending on her. But the truth was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. Dominic Thorne, the man who had stolen her heart in a single night, wasn't just a powerful businessman. He was a tycoon with secrets, secrets that could shatter both their lives and the future they had just begun to imagine. What Sarah didn't know, as she stared at the test results in disbelief, was that Dominic had already been looking for her. The powerful man who had once been a stranger was about to become the most important part of her life. And when their paths collided again, it would be under circumstances neither of them could have foreseen. The question remained, could they build a life together, or would the weight of their secrets tear them apart? The weeks that followed were a blur of emotions for Sarah, a whirlwind of confusion, anxiety, and the kind of hope that she had long since buried deep within her. What had begun as a single night of reckless abandon had now set the stage for a future that she couldn't begin to comprehend. She wasn't sure if it was the shock of finding out that she was pregnant with quadruplets, or the bewildering realization that the man she had shared that night with, Dominic Thorne, was, in fact, a billionaire tycoon, someone with the power to alter the course of her life. But one thing was certain. Nothing in her well-ordered, rational world was ever going to be the same again. Her mind, always trained to approach everything through the lens of logic and practicality, now found itself struggling to reconcile the unbelievable truth with the life she had built. For years she had worked tirelessly, climbing the ranks in her career, dedicating herself to healing others and building a world where she controlled every detail. Every decision, every step she took had been calculated, designed to get her ahead. She had never allowed herself to dream beyond the carefully constructed boundaries of her medical career. But now, with 4 tiny lives growing inside her, the walls of her well-ordered life were beginning to crumble. The pregnancy had been a shock. At first, she had dismissed the early signs as stress. She had been busy at work, exhausted from the pressures of managing her new position, balancing her responsibilities as a top pediatrician. But as the weeks passed, it became impossible to ignore. Her body, once the embodiment of controlled perfection, was now showing signs of something bigger than her career, her dreams, and all of the careful plans she had set in motion. She had turned to her closest friend Jasmine, who had listened to the entire ordeal with an expression of incredulity, yet a certain understanding. Jasmine, a corporate lawyer, had always been the free spirit to Sarah's cautious, planned existence. But even Jasmine couldn't deny the gravity of the situation. She had been the one to gently nudge Sarah into confronting the reality of what was happening, even when Sarah had tried to suppress it. One morning, after weeks of self-doubt, Sarah had found herself in her office at the Manhattan Children's Hospital, staring at the ultrasound images in front of her. She could hardly breathe as her eyes scanned the images of the 4 tiny, flickering heartbeats. 4. The word echoed in her mind as if she couldn't quite grasp it. 4 little lives, each one dependent on her. And yet, as her fingers gently touched the edges of the scan, something inside her stirred. This was no accident. This was a destiny that had been woven into the fabric of her existence, even if she had never seen it coming. In that moment, the overwhelming wave of responsibility crashed over her, threatening to drown her in its weight. She had always been the responsible one. She had always known how to care for others, but this was different. She was going to be a mother to 4 children, and the fear of the unknown clung to her like a dark shadow. The medical complications of quadruplet pregnancies were well known to her, and every scenario that played out in her mind only seemed to make the situation more complex. But even then, a part of her, an unfamiliar part, was filled with a deep, protective instinct. The thought of her children, these 4 tiny souls growing inside her, filled her with a kind of awe she had never experienced before. But there was one more thing she had to face. Aisha, the woman who had helped her throughout. The process had given her the truth that had been lurking in the back of her mind. She couldn't go through this alone. The pregnancy wasn't just about the physical care she would need, but the emotional support as well. And that support, as strange as it seemed, would have to come from Dominic. She had tried to avoid thinking about him, about that night. She had tried to suppress the memories of his touch, the warmth of his embrace, and the way he had made her feel alive in a way she hadn't thought possible. But the truth was undeniable. He was a part of this. He was the father of these children. And no matter how much she tried to push him from her thoughts, he would always be a part of her life. Their lives. Their children's lives. Dominic. The name itself carried power, gravitas. He was a tycoon, a man who seemed to control everything around him with ease. She had learned from the media, from the whispers around her, that he was a man who had built an empire from nothing. A self-made billionaire who commanded the attention of boardrooms and press conferences alike. He was the kind of man who could make decisions that affected the lives of millions. And yet, she had seen a different side of him. She had seen the kindness in his eyes when he spoke of making healthcare accessible to the less fortunate. She had heard the passion in his voice when he had described his dreams of reforming the system. What troubled her was not the fact that she had slept with him. No, it was the realization that they were worlds apart. Her life was rooted in the hospital, in the children she cared for, in the small victories she won every day. His life was in the boardrooms, in the high-rise offices that dotted the skyline of Manhattan. He was a businessman, a man of power. And now she was carrying his children, a fact that she had no idea how to process. She had to find him. She couldn't carry these children alone, not with the complexities of a quadruplet pregnancy. Not with the world she had built on one path and now found herself needing to navigate another. But how could she find him? How could she reach out to a man who had disappeared into the shadows of his world? As she sat in her office staring at the ultrasound images again, the door to her office opened. Jasmine walked in, her expression one of concern and determination. She had been there every step of the way, listening, comforting, offering her unrelenting support. "Sarah," Jasmine said, her voice soft but strong. "We need to find him. We need to find Dominic. It's time to face this head on. You can't do this alone." Sarah had nodded, knowing Jasmine was right. The decision had been made, even though a part of her wanted to turn away, to keep the mystery of that night just that, mysterious. But there was no escaping the reality now. She had to find Dominic Thorne. She had to tell him about the children they had created together to share with him the most important news of her life. The journey ahead was one that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The choices she had made, the life she had built, would all be swept away by the current of this unexpected future. But she had no choice now but to move forward, to embrace the unknown, no matter how frightening it was. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Sarah made a promise to herself and to the 4 lives growing inside her. She would find Dominic. She would tell him about the babies, and together they would figure out what came next. There would be no turning back. But for the first time in a long while, she was ready to face what lay ahead. The story was only just beginning, and the most profound changes of her life had yet to unfold. Sarah had never been the type of woman to let the world dictate her future. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to control the chaos around her. As a pediatrician in one of Manhattan's most prestigious hospitals, Sarah had built a life that was carefully crafted, step by step. She had poured herself into her career, earning the respect of her colleagues and becoming a role model for the children she treated. But now, sitting in her modest apartment in Brooklyn, holding the ultrasound images of her quadruplets in her hands, everything she thought she knew about herself, about her world, was beginning to unravel. The weight of what was happening to her was almost too much to bear. She had never imagined that one night could change everything. And yet here she was, carrying the children of a man she hardly knew. A man whose power and wealth seemed so far beyond her own world. Dominic Thorne. The name had been whispered. In hushed tones, a name that carried with it a certain aura of mystique and authority. She had no idea when they shared that one night together that the man she had fallen into bed with was the heir to an empire, the kind of man who could control entire industries with a single decision. But now the truth was clear. Sarah was as pregnant with his children, and whether she liked it or not, their lives were intertwined in ways she could not have predicted. The man who had captured her heart for a night was now the father of her babies, 4 tiny lives growing inside her, and she had no idea how to reconcile the two worlds. His world, where power and wealth were commonplace, and her own world, where every day was a battle to make a difference in the lives of children who had no voice. The realization that Dominic Thorne, this stranger, was the father of her children, sent a wave of anxiety through Sarah. She had worked hard to establish a reputation based on her dedication to her work, her commitment to the children she cared for. Now she was carrying the children of a man who was everything she had never imagined she would be involved with. He was everything she had avoided, everything she had never allowed herself to dream about. But the connection between them, the intense chemistry, was undeniable. There was something about that night, about the way he had looked at her, listened to her and made her feel like she mattered, that stayed with her. It wasn't just the physical connection. It was something deeper, something more profound. But what did that even mean now? What did it mean that she was carrying his children? Was this fate? Or was it just an accident, a series of events that spiraled out of control? And if it was fate, why had it led her to this point, where everything she had worked so hard for now felt so distant and uncertain? In the days that followed, Sarah found herself torn between the two sides of her life. She continued to work at the hospital, treating children and making a difference in the lives of her patients. But her mind was never far from the babies growing inside her. She could no longer ignore the fact that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't have imagined. As much as she tried to focus on her work, her thoughts kept drifting to Dominic. Was he even aware of what had happened? Did he even remember her? Or was she just another one-night stand in his world of endless options and fleeting encounters? It was hard for Sarah to imagine that someone like Dominic could ever be interested in someone like her. She was just a doctor. Someone who lived in a modest Brooklyn brownstone, who worked long hours and had little time for anything else. Dominic, on the other hand, was a billionaire tycoon, a man who could have anything he wanted. His life was filled with luxury, power, and influence, things Sarah had only seen in magazines. She had never been the kind of woman to chase after a man like him, and yet here she was, tied to him by the very children she was carrying. She had tried to move on, to bury the feelings she had for him, to focus on what was ahead, on being a mother to her children. But it wasn't that simple. The memories of that night kept resurfacing, the way he had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her as though she mattered, as though her dreams and ambitions were just as important as his. For once she felt seen, truly seen by someone who wasn't just interested in what she could offer or what she could do for him. It was the kind of connection that Sarah had never experienced before, and the thought of it haunted her. The truth was, she couldn't do this alone. The pregnancy, the future, the decisions that lay ahead, it was all too much for her to handle on her own. As much as she wanted to remain independent, to take care of everything by herself, she knew deep down that this was something bigger than her. She couldn't carry these children alone. They deserved a father, a family, and the man who had given them to her, whether she liked it or not, had a right to know. But the problem was she had no idea how to find him. In the world of the rich and powerful, everything was so carefully controlled. How could she, a simple doctor, ever hope to make her way into his world? How could she even begin to understand the complexities of his life, his business, his empire? What if he didn't want to be a part of this? What if he was like so many others who were only interested in themselves and their own success? Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to step into a world that was far beyond her understanding. She was about to enter a battle that she didn't know how to fight. Dominic Thorne wasn't just a man. He was a force, a powerful presence who had the ability to change everything in her life. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. As she sat in her apartment one evening, staring at the ultrasound pictures of her babies, she realized that the time had come. She had to face Dominic. She had to find him and tell him the truth. There was no more running from it. Her world, the one she had worked so hard to create, was no longer just about her. It was about them, about the 4 little lives growing inside her, about the future they would have, and about the man who had unknowingly become a part of that future. The thought of reaching out to him was terrifying. What would he think? Would he be angry? Or would he be understanding, willing to step into this unknown with her? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't go through this alone. The decision to find him wasn't just about the children. It was about everything that had happened since that night, about the connection they had shared, about the possibility of a future she had never dreamed of. As the days passed, Sarah found herself growing more anxious, more determined to find Dominic. She reached out to friends, did research, and followed every lead she could find. But everything pointed to one fact. He was elusive, a man who lived in the shadows of his empire. Finding him was going to be harder than she had anticipated. But she couldn't give up now. She owed it to her children and to herself to face the truth. The journey ahead would not be easy. The road would be filled with challenges, with uncertainty, and with fears that she wasn't sure she could overcome. But Sarah was a fighter. She had spent her life overcoming obstacles, fighting for the children she cared for the patients who depended on her. Now she had to fight for her own future, for the future of her children, and for the chance to make a life with Dominic Thorne, whether he was ready for it or not. As she closed her eyes that night, her hand resting gently on her stomach, she whispered a promise to her babies. They would not be alone. She would find Dominic, and they would face whatever came next together. The days stretched into weeks, and still Sarah had not found the courage to face Dominic. Her mind was caught in a constant loop, oscillating between fear, uncertainty, and hope. She had come so far in life, carefully constructing a career that had brought her respect and fulfillment. But the moment she discovered she was pregnant with quadruplets, everything she had known, everything she had believed in, seemed to slip through her fingers, leaving her adrift in uncharted waters. Sarah had always been the one to manage chaos, to take control of situations and shape her destiny. She was known for her professionalism, her calm in the face of a crisis, and her ability to provide comfort and care to the children she treated. But now, as she navigated this unexpected pregnancy, she found herself grappling with emotions that felt foreign to her. She wasn't just dealing with a medical condition. She was dealing with an upheaval that had shaken the very foundation of her life. Every time she looked at the ultrasound images of her 4 babies, her heart both swelled with love and ached with the realization of the massive responsibility ahead of her. The prospect of becoming a mother to quadruplets was daunting enough, but doing it without knowing how or if Dominic would be part of their lives made the situation infinitely more complex. She could no longer avoid the inevitable. Her heart told her that she needed to find him, to tell him the truth, no matter how complicated it might be. But she was terrified. Dominic Thorne wasn't just any man. He was a tycoon, a billionaire, with power, influence, and a life that seemed to exist in an entirely different universe from hers. She couldn't help but wonder if he would even care about the children, or if he would see them as an inconvenient mistake. They hadn't exchanged numbers that night. She hadn't even known his last name. The connection they shared in the heat of the moment felt real. But what if it was nothing more than a fleeting passion for him, something to be forgotten the moment the morning light came? What if she was just another conquest for him, a woman he had seduced and then discarded like so many others before her? The thought gnawed at Sarah. She knew she was a strong, independent woman, but in this moment she felt vulnerable, utterly powerless in the face of the unknown. Could a man like Dominic really be involved in the lives of 4 children he hadn't even known about until now? Or would she be left to face this alone? Despite her fears, Sarah knew that there was no going back. She couldn't raise these babies alone, especially not with the knowledge that their father was someone like Dominic. Even if he was a man she didn't fully understand, even if she was terrified of the implications, she knew that for the sake of her children, she needed to find him. The search for Dominic was not as simple as she had hoped. His world was an intricate maze, filled with layers of security and privacy. She couldn't just pick up the phone and call him. She didn't even know where to start. She couldn't just walk into his office, demanding his attention. He was a man who controlled everything around him with precision, a man who had carefully built an empire that spanned continents. He wasn't someone who could be easily reached, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it was her destiny to find him, to bring him into this world they had unknowingly created together. For days, Sarah scoured the city, trying to find any connection that might lead her to him. She reached out to colleagues, did her own research, and pieced together fragments of information that seemed to suggest he was indeed closer than she had ever imagined. His name came up in conversations, mentioned in passing, attached to high-profile charity events, and even linked to the very hospital she worked at. It seemed that every road she followed led her back to him, but still she couldn't get any closer. Her frustration grew. Why did everything feel so out of reach? Why couldn't she simply walk up to him and tell him the truth? The answer was clear. It wasn't just about the babies. It was about what Dominic represented. To Sarah, he wasn't just the father of her children. He was a symbol of a world she had always kept at arm's length, a world of power, money, and privilege. She had worked so hard to distance herself from that world, focusing instead on her patients, her career, and the people who needed her. But now she found herself caught in the very thing she had avoided for so long. Days turned into weeks, and still Dominic remained elusive. Sarah felt like she was chasing a shadow, a man who was everywhere and nowhere all at once. She began to question her decisions. Was she making a mistake by trying to reach out to him? What if it only made things worse? What if he didn't want anything to do with her or their children? But as much as Sarah tried to silence the doubts, a stronger voice inside her urged her forward. She couldn't ignore the bond she had felt with Dominic, the connection that had transcended everything else. That night had meant something to her, something she couldn't explain, something she didn't want to lose. The idea of raising her children without knowing whether he would ever be part of their lives felt wrong. They deserved more than that. They deserved a family, and if Dominic could be a part of that, then she had to at least try. One day, as Sarah was heading to work, she found herself standing in front of a large building in Midtown Manhattan, an address that had come up in her search. The building was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave the impression of power and influence. She didn't know for sure if Dominic was inside, but everything in her told her that this was the place. This was where he could be found. Her heart raced as she walked through the revolving doors, her mind a whirlwind of questions. What would she say to him? How would she explain everything? Would he even believe her? The lobby was quiet almost, eerily so, with only a few employees moving about. Sarah approached the receptionist, her nerves threatening to betray her composure. She knew she couldn't just walk in and demand to see Dominic. She had to approach this carefully, with the same precision and professionalism she had always used in her career. "I'm looking for Dominic Thorne," she said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I need to speak with him." The receptionist studied her for a moment before nodding. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Sarah replied, her heart sinking. "But it's urgent. Please, I need to see him." For a moment, the receptionist hesitated and Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew she was taking a huge risk. But then, to her surprise, the receptionist stood up and made a quick phone call. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the receptionist's eyes flicking toward her nervously. After a few moments, the receptionist hung up the phone and looked back at Sarah. "Please follow me," she said, standing aside to let her through. Sarah's pulse quickened as she followed the receptionist through a maze of hallways, each one more luxurious than the last. The building was a testament to wealth and power, every surface gleaming, every piece of furniture carefully chosen for its sleek elegance. Sarah felt out of place in this world, as though she were a visitor, in a realm where she didn't belong. But she didn't have a choice. She had to find him. Finally, they arrived at an office that looked like something out of a movie, large, imposing, and filled with expensive art and furniture. The receptionist knocked softly before opening the door. "Mr. Thorne, there's someone here to see you," she said before stepping aside. Sarah stepped into the room, her breath catching as she took in the sight of him. Dominic Thorne stood by the large window, his back to her, his presence commanding even without speaking. He turned slowly, his sharp gaze locking onto hers, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. Everything inside Sarah stilled. She had found him, and now everything was about to change. "Sarah," he said, his voice low but unmistakably familiar. "I didn't expect to see you here." The weight of the moment hung between them, thick with unspoken words and emotions. Sarah knew this was the moment she had been building toward. There was no turning back now. She had come this far, and now she had to speak her truth. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. to remain composed. Dominic studied her for a long moment before nodding and motioning for her to sit. His gaze never left hers as they both sat down, and Sarah knew this conversation was going to be one that would alter the course of both of their lives forever. Sarah sat across from Dominic, her heart pounding as the weight of the conversation loomed between them. The room was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the city outside, and her every thought seemed to drown in the anticipation of his response. She could feel the unspoken tension, the raw emotion that hung in the air like a thick fog. This was it, the moment when everything changed. Dominic's presence, as commanding and powerful as ever, seemed to fill the room. Yet, as he looked at her, Sarah saw something unfamiliar in his eyes, something that hinted at vulnerability, at a man who was no longer in control of the situation, a man whose carefully constructed world of business and influence had suddenly been turned upside down by a truth he never saw coming. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She had come here prepared to tell him everything, to reveal the full weight of the secret she had carried with her for weeks. But now, as she sat across from him, those words, those life-altering words, seemed to get caught in her throat. How could she possibly say it? How could she explain something so monumental, so incomprehensible, without the fear of being judged, dismissed, or worse, rejected? Dominic leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers, his face unreadable. He was waiting for her to speak, but his silence felt like an invitation, not a demand. And yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into an unknown abyss. I didn't know how to tell you, Sarah finally whispered, her voice shaky despite her efforts to stay composed. The words felt like a confession, as though admitting the truth was somehow a betrayal of the life she had tried so hard to build. When we were together that night, I never imagined that anything like this would happen. And now, here I am with... She stopped herself, unable to continue, the enormity of the situation weighing down on her shoulders like an insurmountable burden. Dominic's brow furrowed slightly, and for a brief second Sarah thought she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Was it concern? Was it something deeper? But it was gone so quickly that she couldn't be sure. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but carried an edge of something more. Curiosity, confusion, maybe even something like fear. Sarah, what are you trying to say? His words hung in the air between them, more of a plea than a question. She swallowed hard, feeling the tears prick at the corners of her eyes. How could she say this to him? How could she tell him that the one-night encounter that neither of them had expected had led to something so extraordinary and so terrifying that it now threatened to change the course of both their lives? I'm pregnant, she finally blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush. And not just with one baby, but 4 quadruplets. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Dominic sat there motionless, his face an unreadable mask. Sarah could feel her heart beating wildly in her chest as she waited for him to react, for him to say something, anything that would tell her what he was thinking. But there was nothing. Just a cold, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Her breath caught in her throat as the reality of what she had just said sank in. The room felt smaller somehow, the air thick with the weight of the words she had just unleashed. Quadruplets. The word echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, each repetition only serving to remind her of the impossible situation she now found herself in. Finally, Dominic moved, though it was almost imperceptible. His gaze softened, just a fraction, but it was enough to make Sarah's heart skip a beat. She had seen that look before, when he had listened to her talk about her work, about the children she cared for. He had listened with a depth of attention that suggested something more than simple curiosity. It was as though he saw her, really saw her beyond the surface, beyond the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. And now, as she sat before him, vulnerable and raw, that same intensity was there, only this time it was directed at the most important thing of all, the future of their children. 4. Dominic finally spoke, his voice low, almost in disbelief. His hands were resting on the desk, fingers splayed, as though the simple act of touching something solid might anchor him in the face of such an overwhelming revelation. Sarah nodded, her heart aching as she watched him struggle to process what she had just revealed. She had expected shock. She had even prepared herself for anger, for him to dismiss her or question her judgment. But instead there was just a quiet intensity, a stillness that seemed to stretch between them. This This wasn't supposed to happen, he murmured, more to himself than to her. He looked out the window for a moment, his gaze fixed on something distant, as though he were searching for some kind of answer in the sprawling city below. I didn't know, Sarah. I had no idea. But 4? The way he said the word 4 sent a ripple of emotion through her. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something that bordered on awe. Dominic was a man who had built empires, who had managed crises that would break most men. And yet in this moment, as he looked at her with that mix of confusion and something deeper, Sarah realized that this was the one thing he couldn't control. He couldn't plan for this. He couldn't fix it. And for the first time, the great Dominic Thorne seemed small, fragile, human. I didn't know how to tell you, Sarah repeated softly, her voice breaking slightly. She reached for the ultrasound images she had brought with her, laying them carefully on the table between them. I didn't know if you would even want to know. But these babies, our children, they deserve more than just my care. They deserve a father. Dominic's eyes flicked down to the images, his expression unreadable as he took them in. For a long moment he said nothing. His gaze moved over the images, then back to Sarah. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, the calculations he was making, the decision he was about to reach. She could feel the shift in the air, the tension thickening as he prepared to confront whatever truth lay ahead. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. What do you want from me, Sarah? His question hung in the air, so simple yet so profound. What do you need me to do? It was a question that cut to the heart of everything. What did she need from him? She needed his support, yes, but she also needed his understanding. She needed to know if he would stand by her, if he would be there for the children they had created together. She needed to know if the man who had brought so much power and control into the world could find it in himself to be part of something as vulnerable, as fragile as family. I need you to be a father, she said quietly, her voice firm despite the fear that twisted in her chest. I need you to be there for them. For us. Dominic didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and strong. The gesture was simple, but it sent a rush of warmth through her, a reminder that despite everything, he was here. He hadn't walked away. He hadn't dismissed her. He hadn't run. I'll be there, he said, his voice soft but filled with resolve. I don't know what this will look like, Sarah, but I'll be there. For you, for them, for us. In that moment, everything shifted. The fear, the uncertainty, the sense of being overwhelmed, it all seemed to melt away, replaced by something stronger, something more enduring. Sarah looked at Dominic, really looked at him, and saw not the tycoon who could crush empires with a word, but the man who was willing to step into the unknown with her, to face a future he hadn't planned for, and to embrace the family that had been created in the most unexpected way. For the first time since she found out she was pregnant, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that promised everything would be easy, or that there wouldn't be challenges ahead, but it was a hope that told her she wasn't alone. And that in itself was enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. Thank you, she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Thank you for this. For being here. Dominic squeezed her hand. Thank you, Sarah, he said softly. Thank you for giving me the chance to be part of this, part of our family. And with that, the two of them sat together in the silence of the room, the weight of the future stretching out before them, uncertain but filled with the promise of new beginnings. As Sarah stepped into the private elevator of Dominic's penthouse, she could feel her heart racing in her chest, echoing the rhythm of uncertainty that had settled into her soul. The soft chime of the elevator doors closing was a stark reminder that her life, her future, was about to take a monumental turn. Dominic, standing beside her, was silent, his gaze fixed ahead, his thoughts seemingly as distant as the skyline that stretched out beyond the glass walls of the building. Yet, despite the quiet that enveloped them, there was an unspoken bond, an understanding that had grown between them over the past few weeks, ever since Sarah had shared her secret. Allah, weight of the upcoming conversation lingered in the air. They had talked, yes, but in fragments. Now, as they stood on the cusp of an entirely new chapter, Sarah couldn't help but feel the enormity of it all. The babies, the shared responsibility, the unknown future that loomed before them like a vast, uncharted ocean. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and in a way comforting. For the first time, she had felt the truth sink in. Dominic wasn't walking away. He had chosen to face this with her. When the elevator doors opened, they were greeted by the quiet sophistication of his penthouse. The warm minimalist design, the elegant furniture, and the breathtaking view of the city below. It all felt like a world apart from the uncertainty that churned within her. She had visited this space only once before, during a fleeting moment of passion that had now become the defining moment of their lives. Now stepping into it again, she couldn't shake the feeling that this place, this space, was where everything had shifted, where everything was beginning to come together in a way neither of them had expected. Dominic led her through the large living room, his hand gently resting on her lower back, a subtle but constant reminder that she was not alone. His steps were measured, purposeful, but there was something in the way he held himself that spoke to the tension, the weight of what they were about to face together. For the first time, Sarah realized how much of a leader Dominic was, not just in his business empire, but in the way he carried himself in moments of uncertainty. It was a strange comfort to know that, no matter how daunting the journey ahead, he would be there. They reached the expansive dining room, where a table had been set with an array of food, fresh fruits, delicate pastries, and an assortment of juices. It looked almost out of place, like a scene from a movie, too perfect, too polished for the raw emotions both of them were trying to navigate. Dominic paused at the edge of the table, his hands resting on the back of one of the chairs as he turned to face Sarah. His eyes, dark and intense, searched her face, as though waiting for something, waiting for her to speak. "I've been thinking about this," Dominic said, his voice softer than usual, lacking the usual confidence that radiated from him in every other aspect of his life. "About what you said earlier about the babies, about us. I don't want you to think I haven't been processing everything, because I have. It's just a lot to take in." Sarah nodded, her own heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had been thinking the same thing, wondering what kind of life this would be for them. They hadn't had time to truly discuss what would come next, what they were both willing to sacrifice, and what they hoped to gain from this strange, unexpected union. The reality was that neither of them had planned for any of this. And yet, despite the fears and doubts that weighed them down, there was something undeniable about their connection, something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Dominic continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking about the future a lot," he said, his words deliberate, each one weighed with intention. "About what I can give you and the babies, what kind of father I can be. I never thought I would be in this position. Never. Imagined I would be a father, much less to quadruplets. But I want you to know, Sarah, that I'm not running from this. I'm not going to shy away from what's ahead. I'm in this with you." His words, simple yet profound, hit Sarah harder than she anticipated. She had expected him to feel overwhelmed, to question what it meant for his empire, his reputation. But this was something different. This was Dominic, strong, commanding, yet now vulnerable, laying himself bare for her, offering her not just his support, but his commitment to something greater than both of them. "I'm scared too," Sarah admitted, her voice small, almost fragile in comparison to the magnitude of the moment. "I don't know what this will look like or how we'll make it work. But what I do know is that I can't do it alone. I've never felt more vulnerable in my life. These babies are a miracle, but they're also a responsibility. And I need someone who understands that, who will be there for them. For me." Dominic stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his presence overwhelming but comforting all at once. He took her hands in his fingers warm and steady. "You're not alone, Sarah," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "I'm here, and I will be here for you, for them, every step of the way. I won't let you face this on your own." The words settled in the space between them, the room suddenly feeling smaller, more intimate. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to breathe, to release the tension that had been coiled tightly within her since that fateful night. She had never imagined herself in this situation. She had never imagined Dominic being a part of it. And yet here they were, two people who had crossed paths in the most unexpected way, now bound together by four tiny lives that needed their love, their protection. "I don't know what's coming next," Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "But I do know that I'm not walking away from this, from you, from our children." Dominic nodded, his thumb tracing circles on her hand as he leaned in closer. "Neither am I," he murmured. "And I'll make sure you never have to." In that moment, as Sarah stood in his penthouse, her hand resting in his, the overwhelming fear of the unknown seemed to dissipate, replaced by a flicker of hope. This wasn't the path she had envisioned for herself, but it was the one she was on. And with Dominic by her side, she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together they would figure it out. Together they would build something new, something unexpected, something worth fighting for. Dominic released her hand, gesturing for her to sit at the table. "I've been thinking about the future of our family," he said, his voice steady, his resolve clear. "And I want to make sure that we have everything we need, everything the babies will need. We're not just talking about living arrangements or finances. I'm talking about making sure we have a team, a support system in place to help us every step of the way." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with the possibilities. She had never thought of herself as someone who needed a team, but with quadruplets on the way, the reality was different. She would need help, more help than she could provide, on her own. And Dominic, with his vast resources and connections, could provide that. But more than that, she realized, what they needed most was a shared vision. A vision of what kind of parents they wanted to be, and how they could navigate this unfamiliar path together. "I'll do whatever it takes," Sarah said, her voice full of determination. "For them. For us." Dominic smiled, the intensity in his eyes softening. "That's all I need to hear," he said before adding, "We'll figure it out. Together." And with that they sat down at the table, the weight of the future now, shared between them. The journey ahead would be challenging, no doubt. But as they spoke about the logistics of their new life, the support systems they would put in place, and the responsibilities they would both take on, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. With Dominic by her side, they would face the future head-on, armed with love, commitment, and the unwavering belief that together they could overcome anything. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt the grip of fear loosen. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. They were in this together, and that was enough to give her the strength to face whatever came next. The soft hum of the city below was a distant memory as Sarah stood by the window of the penthouse, her gaze lost in the horizon. It was a quiet moment, the kind that had once been so rare in her life, and yet now, as she looked out over the sprawling skyline of Manhattan, it felt like a quiet before the storm. Her mind had been racing for days, weeks even, but now, standing here in Dominic's space, in his world, everything seemed to slow down, if only for a moment. The weight of what had happened between them, the passion, the connection, the choices they'd made, was heavy in her heart. 4 tiny lives were growing inside her, each one a miracle, each one a twist of fate that had brought them to this point. She had never expected any of this. She had never imagined that a chance encounter in a bar would turn into a journey that would transform everything she thought she knew about life, love, and the future. And yet here she was, standing at the precipice of a new beginning with Dominic by her side. Dominic. His presence was constant, always close, and yet at the same time distant in his own way. He was the man who commanded boardrooms, who held the fate of empires in his hands. But to her, he had become something else entirely. A partner, a protector, someone who had made it clear without words that he would be there for her no matter what. His support had been unwavering, and in these past weeks he had proven that his commitment to their shared future was more than just a passing gesture. He had stepped into the role of the father with a resolve that surprised her, a determination that matched his ironclad will in business. Yet as Sarah thought about their future together, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the right choice, if they were truly ready for what was to come. The world they were stepping into was not a simple one. It was a world where their love story, their unexpected family, would be scrutinized by the public, by his corporate rivals, and by a media that had already begun circling. The pressure was mounting, and with it, the fear that maybe, just maybe, this beautiful, miraculous life they were trying to build would fall apart before it even began. She turned away from the window, glancing at Dominic as he stood across the room, speaking softly on the phone with one of his executives. His voice was calm, but she could hear the tension in it, the stress of his world bleeding into the quiet moments they were trying to carve out. It was a reminder that no matter how much he cared for her, no matter how much he wanted to protect, their growing family, his empire would always be a part of him, a part that would in many ways define their lives together. But Dominic wasn't just his business. He was more than that. She had seen it in the way he cared for her, in the way he listened when she spoke about her fears and her dreams. She had seen it in the tenderness he showed when he put his hand on her growing belly, when he whispered promises to their children, even before they were born. This wasn't a man who saw them as an obligation, as a chapter in a story he had to write. This was a man who had chosen to be with her, who had chosen to walk through the chaos of life with her by his side. And that made all the difference. As she walked toward him, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't feel the fear of the unknown threatening to swallow her whole. There was a quiet certainty in her chest, a belief that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, they would face it together. Their love was not just a fleeting passion, it was a foundation, a bond that had already weathered so much. And if they could survive the storm of uncertainty that had already begun to swirl around them, then perhaps they could survive anything. When Dominic finished his call and looked up at her, his eyes softened. His gaze held a mixture of affection, pride, and concern, a complexity that she had come to recognize as his true self. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost tentative. "I know this is all a lot to process." Sarah smiled, a small, reassuring smile that didn't quite mask the depth of her feelings. "I'm okay," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was still racing. "I'm just thinking about everything that's to come. But I know one thing for sure. I'm not doing this alone." Dominic's expression softened even more, and he stepped closer, his presence a comfort in the midst of everything. "You're never alone," he said, his voice low and filled with conviction. "I'm here, and I always will be." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding settling around them. It was a silence that spoke volumes, of promises made, of challenges yet to be faced, and of a future that, no matter how uncertain, was theirs to shape. Sarah closed the distance between them, her hand reaching for his. "I'm scared," she admitted, the vulnerability in her voice surprising even herself. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this, but I know that I'm ready to try. With you." Dominic's fingers curled around hers, his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice unwavering. "We've already made it this far and we'll keep going. Together." And as Sarah stood there, looking into Dominic's eyes, she realized that it wasn't the uncertainty of the future that scared her. It was the idea of facing it without him. But with him by her side, she felt a strength rising within her. A strength that came from the love they had shared, the bond they had built, and the family they were about to create. The challenges ahead would be immense. The scrutiny, the pressure, the unknowns, they would all be there waiting for them. But Sarah was no longer afraid. She was no longer overwhelmed by the enormity of the path before her. She knew that together they could face whatever came their way. They had already overcome so much. And now it was time to build something beautiful from the chaos. Their family, their future, and the love that had blossomed between them. As they moved toward the next chapter of their lives, hand in hand, Sarah knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a new beginning. It was the beginning of everything. And with Dominic by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next, ready to take on the world with the family they had created together. Their story had only just begun. In the story of Sarah and Dominic, what began as a fleeting encounter between strangers quickly evolved into a journey of self-discovery, love, and resilience. Sarah, a woman of conviction and independence, never imagined that one night would change the course of her life forever. And Dominic, a man whose empire was built on control and precision, found his heart stirred by an unexpected connection, leading him to confront his own vulnerabilities. Together, they faced overwhelming challenges: the discovery of an unplanned pregnancy with quadruplets, the weight of public scrutiny, and the pressures of blending personal life with a high-profile business career. But through it all, their bond remained unshaken, built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and an undeniable love. They learned that love is not just about grand gestures, but about consistency, sacrifice, and the courage to face the unknown together. The story of Sarah and Dominic teaches us that life's greatest blessings often come unexpectedly, and it's in those moments of uncertainty where our true strength is revealed. The lesson here is to embrace the unexpected, trust the process, and face challenges with someone who truly supports and believes in you. In our own lives, we must remember that love and success are not solely about control. They are about partnership, growth, and facing the unpredictable journey ahead with faith.